Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, United States, October 12th, 2024. The air seems to hold its breath as the hallway nightlight flickers once, then steadies, like a small star refusing to die. Brian, only 5 years old, sits up in bed with a calm that does not belong to midnight. His parents are half asleep in the doorway when the child speaks something that changes everything. I saw the place where fire remembers names. The door shut, and a voice like thunder said, "Warn everyone, for I am holy." The sound of those words cuts the quiet, like an ancient whisper returning from the pages of Revelation. His mother's hand trembles around the doorknob. His father forgets the sentence he was about to say. It isn't hysteria. It isn't a dream clinging to a child's lips. It feels older, like a bell that has tolled for centuries and has finally found this house. Suddenly the room is not just a room. The second hand on the clock seems to hesitate. The soft light warms into a faint gold, as if dawn arrived early just to listen. There is no fear, not exactly. There is a presence, solemn, watchful, intimate, like a robe's hem passing lightly across the threshold. The ordinary dissolves into a hush where the past and the eternal stand shoulder to shoulder. One might say it is nothing, and yet everything bends toward it. What if it wasn't a nightmare? What if the soul remembers more than we allow? There are questions no scientist can cage and no skeptic can starve. The boy, Brian, speaks with the simplicity of someone who has not learned the word impossible. For an instant, what we call real bows before something larger. Scripture breathed, judgment thundering, mercy waiting. The words lake of fire no longer belong to an ancient page. They crackle in the air like coals in a prophet's hand. And the child, fragile voice, steady gaze, becomes a window where eternity looks inward. If you had been there, if your feet had stood barefoot on that carpet while a small voice carried the weight of heaven, what would you have felt? Would your chest have known that quiet trembling that admits without pride, "I am not ready"? Would you have sensed the world preparing to lift a veil too heavy for daylight? Stay. Do not rush away. Sometimes the holy speaks louder than reason and asks not to be explained, but heard. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Early 2024. The small town still carried the weight of winter on its rooftops. Snow clung to the corners of mailboxes and the iron gates of old houses. At the edge of a narrow street, a white house with a cross above the door stood in quiet faith. It belonged to the Morgan family, humble, church-going, and anchored in the simple rhythm of prayer and work. Every morning, before the coffee pot hissed, a candle was lit beside a framed verse. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Inside, little Brian moved through the house like a whisper. He was 5. But there was something stiller about him, as if he carried the hush of dawn wherever he went. His mother, Grace, often said, "He listens more than he talks, and sometimes I wonder what he's listening to." Zoom. His father, Daniel, a volunteer at the local chapel, smiled when he heard that, though deep down, he too had noticed the strange peace around his son. Neighbors adored Brian. He was polite, tender, and had a gaze that lingered longer than most children's, not staring but searching, as if the world were a verse waiting to be read aloud. He never played rough, never raised his voice. At church, when the choir sang "Holy, Holy, Holy," his lips moved soundlessly, but his eyes filled with tears. The pastor once placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "That child feels what the rest of us only repeat." The Morgans lived with few luxuries but abundant reverence. The family prayed before every meal, and every Sunday the same pew waited for them. 3rd row, left side, near the stained glass window depicting the angel with a burning sword. Brian always sat beneath that image, staring upward. Grace sometimes followed his gaze and felt something she couldn't name, a pull or maybe a reminder. Life was steady, simple, No one expected revelation in Bethlehem anymore. It was just a name, a coincidence. But sometimes coincidence trembles on the edge of prophecy. One evening, while Daniel tuned the radio and Grace folded laundry, Brian drew quietly at the kitchen table. Crayons spread like offerings, black, red, gold. He pressed one line after another until a scene took shape, a river of fire under a dark sky, figures reaching upward, and a man in white standing over them, holding a book. When Grace leaned over, her breath caught. "What's this, sweetheart?" she asked. Brian looked up with those calm eyes and said only, "It's from before." She didn't understand, not yet. But something in the way he said it, soft, matter-of-fact, unafraid, left her heart unsteady. In the nights that followed, he began to wake before dawn, sitting by the window, whispering small prayers no one had taught him. Daniel heard him once say, "Let them be warned before it's too late." The words chilled him, but when he entered the room, Brian was asleep again, the candle on his nightstand flickering, though no one had lit it. The days passed, and the quiet deepened. Grace began to notice that the boy seemed to anticipate things, a phone call before it rang, a knock before it came. Sometimes he would stop mid-play and look toward the door, whispering, "They're near." When asked who, he'd smile gently and answer, "The ones with light." No one spoke of it aloud, but the air in that small house began to carry a subtle expectancy, like the breath before an angel appears. Even the family Bible, worn, marked, loved, seemed to open on its own more often, its pages stopping at Revelation as if led by invisible fingers. Have you ever seen a child like this? One who didn't have to speak much for the air around him to change? The spring wind had only just begun to soften the chill in Bethlehem when the Morgans realized that their son's calm was no longer ordinary. There were moments when the house seemed to listen before he spoke. The ticking of the kitchen clock slowed, the hum of the refrigerator faded, and in that silence Brian would say something that neither Grace nor Daniel could forget. One afternoon, as Grace prepared bread for Sunday service, she heard him humming by the window. The tune was not one she had ever taught him. It sounded older, shaped by the weight of 1,000 prayers. When she asked where he had learned it, he said quietly, "It's the song they sing when a soul comes back from the fire." She froze, the dough trembling in her hands. "What fire, Brian?" The boy looked down, tracing circles on the glass with his fingertip. "The one that remembers," he whispered. That night, she told Daniel. He tried to laugh it off, but the laughter came thin. "Kids say things," he muttered, turning off the lamp. Yet when he closed his eyes, he saw the way his son's gaze had lingered, steady, sorrowful, ancient. He dreamt of smoke that night, of a light trying to break through it. Days passed, and Brian began to speak of things that no one had taught him. "There's a place where time burns," he said once at breakfast. "But the angels wait outside, so no one forgets that mercy still lives." Grace gripped the table, her coffee untouched. Daniel watched his son's lips move slowly, as if repeating a message dictated from somewhere beyond language. He drew again, this time a gate of stone with writing in red. Above it, a line of light, like a sword. When Grace asked what the words meant, Brian said, "They say, 'Not yet.'" It was the tone that frightened her most, not fear, but knowledge. He spoke as though he had seen it with his own eyes. When visitors came, he stayed near the corners, watching, silent, polite. But sometimes when the pastor came to bless the house, Brian would look at him and murmur, "You have no idea how loud prayers sound on the other side." Grace began to keep a notebook of his sayings. She wrote them quickly as if recording something fragile. March 28th. Brian said the fire cries for those who don't believe it exists. April 3rd. He woke up crying. Said a voice told him, "Tell them I still wait." April 6th. Candle lit itself again. no draft, no matches nearby. At church, people noticed the family's unease. The pastor suggested rest, maybe counseling, but Grace could not shake the feeling that their son had touched something real, something forbidden. When she knelt beside his bed one evening, she asked softly, "Why did God show you those things, Brian?" He looked at her with that impossible calm and said, "Because people forgot he can still speak in fire." She could not reply. The words pressed against her chest like a hidden prophecy. One night, a storm rolled over the town, thunder shaking the windows. Daniel went to check on Brian, but stopped in the doorway. The boy was standing on his bed, eyes open, not frightened. His small hands were raised, palms outward, as if shielding something unseen. "They're falling," he whispered, but he said not to let them. Lightning flashed, and for an instant Daniel thought he saw light moving behind his son, a form, winged, immense, gone as quickly as it appeared. When the thunder faded, Brian looked at him and said simply, "Dad, it's not forever. The fire stops when they listen." Then he lay down and slept. For a long time, Daniel stood there unable to move, the storm raging outside and something far greater stirring within. The words "not forever" repeated in his mind until dawn. Grace found him in the kitchen hours later, Bible open to the book of Revelation. The candle beside it burned steadily, though no one remembered lighting it. She looked at him, and neither spoke. They both knew their world had shifted. Something ancient had stepped inside their small modern home and refused to leave. If your child said something like that, would your heart believe, or would it flee from what it cannot understand? By late spring, the quiet around Brian was no longer simply quiet. It was expectancy. The house seemed to breathe between events, as though something invisible arranged the hours with a patience older than time. Grace tried to keep the routines in place: breakfast at 7, psalms before school, a candle at dusk, the Lord's Prayer at night. But even these familiar gestures felt newly alive, like instruments tuned by a hand she could not see. Small signs multiplied. The family Bible began to fall open more and more often to the same pages, Revelation 20 and 21. The first few times they laughed it away as chance, but chance is a thin garment for a presence that refuses to be clothed. On certain evenings, a scent of frankincense threaded the hallway without source. On others, the radio, if left on low, lost the station and replaced it with a faint chorus, a fragment of "Holy, Holy, Holy" carried on static, a hymn that belonged to no program and to every age. Brian's drawings became more exact. The river of fire he had traced in blocky reds softened into a current of layered color, ember, vermilion, a yellow-white core like metal poured from a furnace. Figures were no longer stick bodies. They were silhouettes with gestures, some shielding their faces, others reaching, always reaching. Above them, the man in white remained, but his posture changed. On the new page, his hand was extended, palm downward, as if stilling a storm. A book lay open at his feet. When Daniel touched the drawn book, the page felt slightly warm. Grace kept writing the moments down. April 17th. B heard a choir. No one else did. He asked if we could tell them to sing Psalm 29, like thunder on the waters. April 30th. Bible fell open to Rev 20 again. B traced Book of Life with his finger and kissed the words. May 9th. He told Mrs. Alvarez at the door, "God told me to say, He remembers your mother. Forgive in time." She cried and said no one knew they had argued before her mother died. The town began to notice without agreement. Some said the Morgan boy was merely sensitive. Others whispered he was marked. The pastor, cautious and kind, returned more frequently, always with prayer, never with spectacle. When he sat across from Brian, he asked simple questions. "What do you see when you close your eyes?" The boy answered with plain diction, as if describing the park. A place like a valley and not a valley. The ground is bright. It hurts, but it's fair. There is a fence that is love and judgment. People can hear through it, but don't listen. The pastor, seasoned by years of funerals and baptisms, felt his composure fray around the edges, yet not all was terror. Alongside the visions of warning came a widening gentleness in Brian. He became more attentive to small hurts. He noticed when a child on the playground sat alone, and without a word he sat beside him until the silence softened. When Mr. Keller's dog ran into the street and a car screeched just short, Brian went quiet for a long time, then later told Daniel, "Someone pushed the car back with their wing." Daniel didn't ask who. He could not bear the answer he was beginning to know. Night was the hour when the seam between worlds thinned. Brian woke without startle, like someone who had been called by name. Sometimes he stood at the window, and his lips moved with enormous care, as if each syllable had weight. "Not all fire is hatred," he said once. "Some is a door." Another night, he showed me a page with names. Some letters were bright, some were dim. He said, "Tell them I am not their enemy. Tell them to come while the door is open." Grace held his small shoulders while he spoke, and felt a heat in the air that was not fever, not the room, but a warmth, like bread just broken and shared. The tension inside Daniel grew like weather. He was a man of fixed lines, work, prayer, duty. He had always believed. Now he was forced to believe nearer, and it scared him. At the hardware store, a friend told a loud joke about that holy kid, and Daniel smiled too quickly, eyes on the floor. Later, the shame of it burned in him. That night he knelt on the kitchen tile after everyone had slept and said aloud, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." The refrigerator hummed, the candle guttered, and the room exhaled a silence so complete he felt as if someone had listened through and through. On Pentecost Sunday, the Morgans sat in their usual pew. The sermon was on the Spirit as fire. The pastor spoke gently, mindful of the boys' presence, but Scripture cannot be muzzled. When he read, "Our God is a consuming fire," Brian's eyes lifted to the stained glass with the angel and the sword. The sunlight struck the pane just then, filling the angel's blade with a sudden golden edge. People shifted in their seats as the temperature in the room seemed to rise a degree. After the benediction, no one left quickly. There was a lingering, awkward and holy. An old woman with arthritic hands asked if Brian would pray for her. He did, with the straightforwardness of a child asking for water. Jesus, make her hands new enough to hold her grandchild without pain. The old woman wept, less from relief than from the sweetness of being seen. By summer's first heat, the family had learned a new grammar. They moved through the hours as one moves through a psalm, lament and praise braided into a single breath. Not everything was strange. Groceries still needed buying, lawn mowing still left its green stripes. But even ordinary tasks had an aura, as if performed on a stage where watchers, merciful and immense, stood in the wings. One evening, the doorbell rang. A neighbor stood there, not the curious kind, but the skeptical kind, the kind who carries the shield of a smirk. "So," he said, eyes flicking past Grace's shoulder into the house, "your boy sees angels and hell now? That what we're telling folks?" Grace opened her mouth to answer, but Brian came to the threshold, his face open. "Sir," he said, "God doesn't want you to be afraid of him like a fire you can't touch. He wants you to be afraid of being far away from him." The man's smirk faltered. He cleared his throat and left without another word. An hour later, his wife texted Grace to say he had asked, for the first time in years, if they could pray before dinner. Not all reactions softened. A few avoided the Morgans at the grocery store. Someone on a local message board wrote a post about religious hysteria, and another called for professional help. The pastor endured a letter warning him not to encourage fantasy. He responded as he always did, with courtesy, with firm gentleness, never using Brian's name where it could be exploited, always pointing to Scripture as the measure and mercy as the test. In the private rooms of their home, the mystery kept growing, not as spectacle, but as companionship. On a night of sharp stars, Brian told his parents he had been shown a place shaped like hunger. He said, "It's not the fire that hurts the most. It's wanting God and saying no at the same time." Grace pressed her palms together, aching. Daniel asked, his voice quiet and steady for the first time, "And what did he say to you there?" Brian answered. He said, "Tell them I am not far. Tell them I am at the door. Tell them to knock and keep knocking." Then the boy looked a little sad and added, as if it were the heaviest line of all, he said I should warn everyone. On certain afternoons, a peculiar peace spread from the Morgan porch down the whole block. People slowed their steps without knowing why. Arguments softened. A delivery driver paused, removed his cap, and stood for a moment, as if remembering a promise he had once made as a child. The town could not name it, but they bore witness to it. A quiet authority, neither showy nor shy, emanated from the small figure of a 5-year-old who carried the seriousness of a prophet and the patience of a lamb. The border between the seen and unseen thinned in ways that changed how light looked at 5 p.m., how birds paused on the telephone wires, how the sky over the church held color a little longer than it should. Grace feared they would be found out, and feared at the same time that they would be left alone with this burden. Daniel feared the ridicule, and feared more deeply, losing the nearness that had begun to steady him. They loved their son fiercely, and began to love, with trembling, the one who had given him words that tasted like judgment and mercy at once. And so the days continued, the warning not yet fully spoken, the town not yet fully awake, the pastor praying with new gravity, the parents learning a new way to walk through an ordinary Tuesday. The mystery did not announce itself with trumpets. It grew like a root under the house, like a river finding its ancient path, like a lamp trimmed and kept ready, though no one knows the hour. How many times does the divine walk among us unseen? And when we finally notice, are we ready? Pastor Michael Hayes had served Bethlehem Community Chapel for more than 20 years. He had baptized newborns, married couples beneath the same stained glass, and buried friends in the small churchyard where dandelions grew through the fence each spring. He was not a man of show, but of slow patience. His sermons were quiet enough that people had to lean in. "The truth," he often said, "doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stay." When word reached him about the Morgan boy, he felt an ache he couldn't name. He remembered Brian from the pew by the angel window, always still, always listening. The rumors unsettled him, talk of visions, of warnings, of a voice that spoke through a child. But gossip could wound as easily as truth could heal. So one late afternoon, with a Bible and a small bottle of anointing oil in his coat, Pastor Hayes walked the 2 blocks to the Morgans' home. Grace greeted him with tired eyes and the softness of someone who had been praying without rest. Daniel stood behind her, a man caught between reason and reverence. "He's in his room," Grace whispered. "He said you would come." The pastor hesitated in the doorway of that small bedroom. The air was gentle, almost golden, though the curtains were drawn. Brian sat cross-legged on the floor with an open Bible on his lap, tracing a line of text with his finger. When he looked up, his expression held no fear. "I know who you are," he said simply. "You carry the questions of everyone else." Michael knelt beside him. "That may be true," he answered, his voice trembling slightly. "But tell me, child, what do you carry?" Brian tilted his head as if listening to something behind the silence. "I carry the warning he gave. That mercy is closing like a gate, but not locked yet." He turned the Bible so the pastor could see. His finger rested on Revelation 3:20. "Behold, I stand at the door. and knock. The pastor's breath caught. He had preached that verse dozens of times, yet never had it looked so alive, as if the ink itself shimmered with intention. For a long moment, neither spoke. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, then hushed, as though creation itself leaned closer. When Pastor Hayes finally spoke, it was not to challenge, but to confess. "I have prayed to hear God more clearly," he said, "and now that I am here, I find myself afraid to listen." Brian smiled faintly. That's how it begins. Grace and Daniel watched from the doorway, the scene before them suspended in a stillness that felt older than the room. Pastor Hayes reached out his hand and asked, "May I pray with you, Brian?" The boy nodded. They joined hands. For a moment it was just human warmth, skin to skin, then something deeper, an almost imperceptible pulse that was not heartbeat, but presence. The pastor prayed softly, not for revelation, but for readiness. "Lord, if you are speaking through this child, teach us to listen without fear. If this is a test, give us discernment. And if this is mercy, let us not waste it." As he prayed, a tear traced down his cheek, unbidden and sincere. He felt the boy squeeze his hand lightly, and the words he was about to speak died on his tongue. There was nothing more to add. The silence finished the prayer. From that day on, Pastor Hayes visited weekly. He did not announce it to anyone. The sessions were not interviews, but shared watchfulness. Sometimes they read psalms. Sometimes Brian asked questions about heaven and judgment that no seminary could prepare a man to answer. Once he asked, "Why do people love their sins as if they were children?" The pastor could only whisper, "Because we forget we are the ones who need raising." Their conversations deepened, drawing out both wisdom and weariness. The pastor noticed that each time he left the house, the world outside looked slightly altered, sharper, more awake. Birds seemed to hold their notes longer. Even the hum of traffic had cadence, like the rhythm of a vast unseen liturgy. Not everyone understood his involvement. Elders in the congregation whispered that he was encouraging delusion. A deacon warned him gently to keep things rational. But Michael had begun to suspect that rationality, while noble, was too small a net for the sea of God. Discernment, he told them, is not the same as doubt. He continued to come. He would sit by Brian's bedside as the boy described his dreams, lands of fire that glowed but did not consume, voices crying not in hatred but in regret. "They say his light hurts because it's honest," Brian murmured one night. The pastor took the child's hand and said, "Then may we be brave enough to be honest too." In church the next Sunday, Pastor Hayes spoke of Elijah's whisper, of the still small voice that followed the wind and the fire. He did not mention Brian, but those who had ears felt the echo. After the service, several lingered longer than usual, as though some unseen hand had paused time. Michael knew the line he walked was thin, between shepherd and witness, between faith and fear. Yet every time he met the boy's gaze, he felt less like a man guiding a flock, and more like one standing on holy ground, told to remove his shoes. He began to dream differently. In one dream, he stood at a threshold, and beyond it burned a light too vast to look at. A voice said, "Will you step in, even if it burns away everything you think you know?" He woke with tears on his pillow and the conviction that the question was not for him alone, but for every soul who would one day hear the warning through this child. So he continued to listen, not for signs, not for spectacle, but for that same still small pulse that had moved through a boy's small hand in prayer. And he told no one of the certainty that grew in him, that this was not madness, not manipulation, but the slow unfurling of a message meant to be heard through humility itself. Would you have the courage to look into that child's eyes? Or would you turn away, afraid of what you might find there? By midsummer, Bethlehem felt different, though no one could agree on why. The town did not wake one morning to trumpets or headlines. It changed the way evenings change, quietly, with the light lingering longer over the steeple and the elm trees along Walnut Street. Some said it was the weather. Others said it was the choir's new hymns or the volunteer hours at the food pantry. But those who had stood near Brian knew the difference had a pulse, and that pulse was prayer. It began with small reconciliations, like threads stitching a frayed garment. Mr. Rivera and his brother had not spoken for 2 years over a property line no thicker than a shoestring. One Saturday, as Brian and his mother walked past the hardware aisle where the brothers worked in stony silence, the boy paused. He looked at the tape measures and said to no one in particular, "Love doesn't need inches." Mr. Rivera, embarrassed and defensive, muttered under his breath. That night he found himself dialing his brother's number at 11:03 p.m., a time he would never have chosen. The next morning, 2 men stood in the parking lot of Bethlehem Community Chapel with red eyes and a single shared smile, the kind that says, "The war is over," without explaining who surrendered first. At the diner, where eggs came with the kind of coffee that could strengthen a fence post, the waitress noticed that the breakfast rush felt slower in a good way. People lingered. Someone at table 3 asked someone at table 7 how their mother was doing after surgery, though table 3 had never met table 7. A handful of regulars left larger tips. An old Vietnam veteran sat alone, staring at the framed verse on the wall that the owner's grandmother had hung when the place opened. "Come to me, all who are weary," he told the waitress. "I heard a child pray that in my head, like he was holding a door. Don't call me crazy." She didn't. She topped off his cup and whispered, "You're not." Rumors traveled with a curious decency, as if even gossip had been softened by reverence. A mother said her daughter's nightmares stopped the night Brian put his hand on her forehead and said, "Sleep where the shepherd watches." A high school coach credited a church kid's prayer for a player's unexpected forgiveness after a foul that could have ended a season. No one pointed microphones. Nobody shouted. The town had discovered a new language of understatement. It helped. I can't explain how. The skeptical voices didn't disappear. They grew sharper. A local blogger posted a series called Small Town Hysteria, warning of collective delusion and the manipulation of a child's imagination. The tone was brittle enough to cut a finger, but even critics found themselves pausing on their way past the Morgan house. People slowed at the corner of Cedar and Fifth, looked once at the porch, and continued on with an odd reluctance, as if leaving a conversation too soon. Later, they would realize they had hummed a hymn without meaning to. Pastor Michael noticed the confessional lines after Sunday service lengthen, not toward him, but toward one another. Marriages did not suddenly become easy, but words like, "I'm sorry and I forgive you," began to sound less like a courtroom and more like a table. He watched teenagers, those quicksilver hearts, turn down the volume on sarcasm and turn up the volume on kindness. At youth group, a shy girl asked if they could read from Revelation, which no one had asked for in recent memory. When the pastor glanced at Brian, the boy nodded as if to say, "Yes, here also." The visitation circle widened beyond church walls. Grace took Brian to the nursing home on Thursdays with a tin of cookies shaped like little crosses that always crumbled just enough to make a holy mess. The first week, a woman with dimming eyes who remembered only hymns and the name of her childhood dog suddenly said to Brian, "Tell him I'm not angry anymore," and then fell asleep smiling. Another resident, hardened by years and disappointments, asked for no religious talk. So Brian told him about sparrows and sunshine and the taste of cold water when you've waited too long to drink. "That's religious talk," the man grumbled, blinking too much. "No," Brian answered. "That's what God made." The man asked for prayer anyway. At the food pantry, Brian carried bags too large for his arms. He would stop sometimes and look at a particular item as if it were written in a language only he could read. "This one for her," he said once, placing a jar of honey in a widow's bag. She stared at it and covered her mouth. "My husband always bought me honey after hard weeks," she whispered. "I told no one that this week was the hardest since he died." No cameras, no applause, just honey in a bag and eyes too wet to see clearly. There were signs too gentle to name miracle and too exact to call coincidence. A lawn sign that had been used as a neighborhood insult curled back on its metal frame and was gone by morning. The most impatient driver in town, known for horn blasts that could scare birds out of trees, stopped at a crosswalk and waved 3 people across with a patience bordering on strange. He checked his watch afterward and found he was not late. Resistance kept its spine. A few parents forbade their children from playing with Brian, calling him that hell boy, as if warning were a contagion. The phrase found Grace like a stone through a window. She cleaned up the glass in her heart quietly. Daniel, still learning to walk in humility's shoes, burned with a father's anger, and then, remembering the boy's words, "Warn everyone, let the fire turn to prayer." The Morgans did not argue with neighbors. They loaned them ladders and spices and time. In a midweek service, the chapel held a circle of folding chairs and candles in glass jars that once hosted pickles. No spotlight, no stage, just a reading of scripture and space to speak. A young mother confessed she had been turning arguments into altars of pride. A retired science teacher stood and said he feared losing his respectability if he admitted that he, too, had felt something like a hand on his shoulder when the boy prayed. "And yet," he added, "I would like to be respectable to heaven." A laughter rose, warm, grateful, unashamed. Then a silence followed, the kind that doesn't ask permission to be holy. Stories began to braid. A shoplifter returned what he had taken. A son called home. A teacher apologized to a student for speaking too harshly. A businessman paid an invoice he had held for months, saying, "I've been stealing time." White lies felt like stones in the mouth. Old bitterness tasted stale. People began to check their words before they left their tongues, as if the town had met its own conscience and found it kind. Through it all, Brian remained a child. He spilled juice, lost a shoe, and laughed so hard at a squirrel on the fence that Grace thought heaven must be full of such laughter. He asked for pancakes in the shape of stars and drew fiery rivers beside stick-figure families holding hands. When children lined up to talk to him after church, he spoke to them about their pets and math homework and what it feels like to be left out. Only sometimes, when prompted by a tremor none could see, did he say, "He loves you too much to pretend your choices don't matter," and the children nodded as if he had told them a secret about gravity. The town did not become holy overnight. Bethlehem remained mortal and ordinary, with sirens sometimes in the distance and bills to pay, and geese that left messes where no one wanted them. But the atmosphere had a softened edge, a reverence, as though the ground remembered that it is always, everywhere, God's. People came to the Morgans' porch in 2s and 3s. They did not ask for spectacle. They asked to be reminded. Brian would sit on the top step with his knees drawn up and say, "It's not about me. He just wanted me to tell you before time cools and the door closes." One evening, as the sky bruised purple and the first fireflies drifted like tiny parables, a man in a suit stood at the curb. He had driven from 2 towns over, a reporter's curiosity dressed as public interest. He didn't step onto the walkway. He watched, measuring angles. Brian looked up and waved. "You can come without the camera," he said. The man flinched, glanced at the equipment in his trunk, and after a long pause, shut it quietly. He came and sat, knees creasing his trousers. "I don't pray," he said. "I don't know how." Brian nodded. You just told him that. The man cried without moving his face, the way people cry when the dam breaks inside, but the world outside is still. Confessions became common, but not cheap. In the grocery line, a woman told a stranger she was sorry for cutting ahead. In the park, a teenage boy handed back a wallet before the owner knew it was missing. A bar owner began closing an hour early on Fridays, not for policy, but because he said the music sounded different after 11, and not in a way that helped souls. "I don't know what I'm doing," he told Pastor Michael. "Maybe you're doing less," the pastor replied. Through the threads of change ran the same warning, quiet and insistent, like a bell no one could find, but everyone could hear. Come, come while there is time. Come while the door is open. Brian never shouted it. He let it rest on people like a shawl laid over sleeping shoulders. The message did its own work. Those who resisted felt it as a pebble in the shoe. Those who yielded felt it as a hand at the small of the back, guiding, steadying, bringing them home. On a Sunday evening, the chapel held a simple hour of music, no sermon, just psalms and silence. The final hymn faded, and without instruction the people remained, eyes closed, hands open, or fists unclenching. Outside, the wind folded itself, and the crickets held a bar of rest. And for one breath, the town of Bethlehem remembered its name. Has your heart ever recognized something before your mind could understand it? Autumn approached quietly, wrapping Bethlehem in gold and ash. The leaves turned, the air sharpened, and yet something deeper than season seemed to gather over the town, as if heaven were leaning close enough to listen. The Morgans' home had become a place of stillness, a small ark amid a sea of questions. Some came there seeking comfort, others came for proof, but all left changed in ways they could not explain. Then came the night everyone would remember. It was a Friday in late October. The church bell had rung 8 times when Grace felt the first tremor of unease. Brian had been silent all evening, sitting on the porch swing, eyes fixed on a horizon that no one else could see. "Is it coming again?" she asked softly. The boy didn't turn. "No," he said. "This time it's waiting." Pastor Michael was already on his way, guided by a heaviness in his spirit that felt like obedience. By the time he reached the Morgans' door, half the neighborhood had gathered outside, not out of curiosity, but instinct. The air shimmered faintly, as if it were holding its breath. Inside, candles flickered, though no one had lit them. A faint hum filled the rooms, not a sound exactly, but the awareness of presence. Brian stood in the living room barefoot, a small Bible pressed to his chest. "He's near," he whispered, eyes wide, not with fear but recognition. He said it's time to speak. Grace dropped to her knees. Daniel held her shoulders. The pastor stepped forward, trembling. "Then speak, child," he said. Brian's voice came soft at first, then steady. He showed me the fire again, the one that remembers names, but this time it wasn't a place for punishment, it was a mirror. Everyone saw themselves, and some could not bear it. He said, "Tell them my justice is love that refuses to lie." The candles swayed as though the air itself bowed to the weight of those words. The boy continued. "He said the door is almost closed, but his hand is still on it. He said, the warning is mercy disguised as thunder." A sound like distant wind filled the room, though the windows were shut. The clock stopped ticking. Even the flame of each candle seemed to lean toward the boy, listening. Then he lifted his face, and his voice changed, not louder, but layered, like another spoke through him. "I am the first and the last. I am the fire that burns and the light that heals. Tell them, the time for trembling is not to fear me, but to return." The words rolled through the house, through the walls, through the gathered crowd outside who could not hear with their ears, but felt something move through their bones. a low chord of holiness that silenced every thought. Pastor Michael fell to his knees. Grace wept into her hands. Daniel whispered, "We are not worthy." And Brian, still radiant, turned to him and said, "He knows. That's why he came." And then, as quickly as it had begun, the air softened. The glow faded from the boy's face. The candles steadied. A single tear slipped down Brian's cheek. "It hurts him," he murmured, "every time someone refuses to listen." He sank into his mother's arms, exhausted, peaceful. For a moment, the room felt like the still heart of creation. No fear, no noise, only the pulse of something eternal. Outside, the wind stirred again, scattering leaves in spirals that glittered under the streetlight like small embers. Some people said later they saw a brightness over the Morgan's roof, not fire, not lightning, just light. One woman claimed she heard a voice whisper, "Do not forget this night." Others said it was only imagination, but their eyes stayed wet when they spoke of it. Pastor Michael rose slowly, his knees aching. He looked at the child now asleep and whispered, "It's done." But he knew it wasn't an ending. It was a sealing, a revelation meant to be carried like a lamp into dark corners. For weeks afterward, those who had been near the house spoke of a change in the air, sharper clarity, deeper calm. Some found themselves confessing things long hidden. Others found peace where bitterness had lived for decades. The warning had not come to frighten, it had come to wake. In the chapel, a vigil was held. No one planned it. People simply arrived, with candles, with tears, with silence. Pastor Michael read Revelation 21:4 aloud. "He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain." When he finished, no one clapped. They just sat, breathing in the same rhythm. The boy, still weak but smiling, attended the next Sunday. He sat beneath the same stained-glass angel, his small hands folded. During the final hymn, he whispered to the pastor, he said, "The fire is not the end, it's the beginning of clean." Pastor Michael felt his throat close. He turned to the congregation and said quietly, "The message has been given. Let those who hear, hear." That night, Bethlehem slept with its doors unlocked. The wind was still. The stars hung low, bright as promises kept, and in the Morgan's house a child slept soundly for the first time in many months, his lips parted in a faint smile, as if dreaming of a light too gentle for human eyes. In the silence of the sacred, would you hear it, or would fear speak louder? Winter came soft to Bethlehem, as if the town itself were exhaling after a long-held breath. The maples along Cedar Street stood bare and honest, the sky a calm linen stretched above the steeple. People still hurried for groceries, still scraped frost from windshields, still waved at stop signs where they should have stopped longer. Life did not become an anthem. It returned to a psalm. The difference was not volume but pitch. The town hummed in a key closer to mercy. In the Morgan home, the days found their old rhythm. Pancakes on Saturdays, shoe hunts on Sunday mornings. That ended predictably with Brian giggling as he discovered the missing sneaker beneath the couch cushion he himself had pushed aside. His crayons returned to landscapes and constellations and stick-figure families holding hands, though if one looked closely, a tiny golden thread ran through the pictures like sunlight stitched into paper. He dozed easier. He woke without whispers at 3 a.m. The candles, when they flared without matches, did so only on feast days, as if the flame itself had learned restraint. Grace noticed the quiet first. Not the hush of fear, nor the heavy stillness of waiting, but the peace after obedience. She found herself humming while she cooked, hymns the town had nearly forgotten. When she folded laundry, she prayed in simple lines, not for signs or answers, but for faith to keep loving what God had placed in her hands. She moved through the house with the gentle solemnity of someone entrusted with a hidden garden, and if tears came, they were no longer from bewilderment, but from gratitude that felt as clean as winter air. Daniel changed in ways he could not have promised himself. The shame of his earlier doubts had been washed into a virtue he had not expected, patience. He became slower to speak and quicker to serve. At the hardware store, he listened fully to a customer before suggesting a tool. At home, he read scripture aloud, stumbling, smiling, starting again. Sometimes he fell asleep in the armchair with the Bible across his chest like a child who had made it to the end of a long story and surrendered to rest in the last paragraph. Pastor Michael carried a new carefulness, like a man who has learned the weight of strong spice and uses it sparingly. His sermons did not name the fire or the boy. They named the one who stands at the door and knocks. He taught the congregation to hear without hunger for spectacle and to obey without bargaining for outcomes. He stopped measuring ministry by attendance and began measuring it by tenderness. Were the harsh becoming gentle? Were the wounded given room to heal without being rushed into testimony? Were confessions protected like fragile birds until they could fly on their own? He reminded the church that wonder, left untended, curdles into gossip, but wonder, guarded by gratitude, matures into worship. The community itself bore marks that only those with quiet eyes could see. The diner owner kept the verse on the wall, but he cleaned the frame and placed a small sprig of evergreen atop it in December. The old veteran started bringing a second cup to his table and setting it across from him. "For the friend who sits with me." Mr. Rivera and his brother shoveled each other's driveways without talking about it. The blogger who had written about hysteria posted an essay titled "About Being Wrong in Public," and then, without drama, turned off comments. People did what people do after visitations. They lived, but they lived with a new attention. A man caught himself about to lie about being late and instead said, "I didn't plan well. I'm sorry." A woman saw her neighbor's garbage bin tipping in a gust and ran to right it with mittened hands, laughing at herself for treating plastic with reverence. Teenagers passed one another in hallways at school and paused once in a while to say, "You okay?" and waited for a real answer. Bethlehem did not become pure, it became porous. Light moved through it with fewer obstructions. Brian was a child again, and he was also more than a child in the way that soldiers are soldiers even when they are home, even when they sleep. He played with toy cars on the carpet and built a city of blocks whose streets all led inevitably to a small open gate. He asked for hot chocolate with too many marshmallows and told jokes that made no sense and laughed until his lungs remembered joy. But on certain evenings, he would sit under the window where the angel sword shone through stained glass on Sundays, and he would rest his hand on his chest and close his eyes just for a moment, like someone feeling the tide come in and out. When asked what he was doing, he would shrug and say, "Listening, if anything needs saying." Most nights, nothing did. Mercy is not a siren, it is a hearth. Christmas approached. The church's nativity figures, scuffed by decades of children's hands, emerged from their dusty boxes. Joseph leaned slightly to the left. Mary's blue had faded to a gentler shade. A shepherd had lost his crook years ago, but still leaned in with a face that could only be called devoted. The baby lay wrapped in cloth that was once white and was now the color of paper left near a window too long. Brian stared a long time at the manger and then looked up at Pastor Michael. "He was warned about too," the boy said quietly. "Only his warning was a promise." The pastor nodded, eyes bright, and did not try to improve on the child's theology. Christmas Eve fell with that particular hush that makes even unbelievers walk softer. The candlelight service stitched a thread of flame from hand to hand until the sanctuary breathed like a single living thing. When the congregation sang Silent Night, Voices wavered and found each other, not because everyone could sing, but because everyone wanted to. During the final verse, Grace felt a hand slip into hers. She turned to see Daniel's face in profile, the candlelight forgiving the hard angles life had carved there. Across the aisle, Pastor Michael heard his own voice thin with tears as he sang, "Sleep in heavenly peace," and understood with a humbling clarity that heaven's peace is not the absence of fire, but the end of running from light. Afterwards, people milled in the cold, their breath small vows in the air. No one spoke of miracles. They spoke of rides home and casseroles, and whose turn it was to bring wood to the Andersons after the storm they all expected. Brian stood beside the snowbank and looked up at the stars. "They look close," he said, as if commenting on the placement of streetlights. Then he yawned the yawn of a child whose greatest battle that night would be with the buttons on his coat. Days shortened. The year turned. The memory of the October night did not fade. It settled, like a seal pressed into wax and cooled, holding shape. Some who had been there found their cynicism returning like a winter ache. Faith is a muscle, and cold finds what is weaker. But even their doubts felt gentler, as if they queried a friend rather than prosecuted a stranger. Others found their hearts chastened into steadiness. They did not stalk wonder. They set the table for it with small obediences and left the door unlatched. And what of the warning? It did not vanish behind novelty. It became part of the town's liturgy, not in words printed in bulletins, but in habits that formed their days. "Come while the door is open," the people had heard, so they visited hospitals without waiting for invitations. They ended feuds not with spectacular reconciliations, but with the quiet laying down of arms. They taught their children that consequences are not cruelty and that love is not permission. They learned to say, "I was wrong," before I was hurt. And slowly, granularly, almost unphotographable, Bethlehem shifted. In late January, a storm cut the power. The town went dark by 5. Windows became candles, families small galaxies. At the Morgan house, the 3 of them sat under blankets, the Bible open by lamplight. Daniel read aloud from Revelation 22, "The river of the water of life, the tree with leaves for the healing of the nations." When he reached, "The Spirit and the bride say, 'Come,'" he stopped and looked at Brian. The boy smiled as if hearing a secret only because it had already been shouted in love across centuries. "That's what he said," he whispered. "That's all he ever says." When the lights flicked back on, there was a moment of honest disappointment. The dark had gathered them, the light scattered them to chores. And yet even in the renewed hum of heaters and the click of returning clocks, the 3 of them sat for a breath longer than necessary, memorizing the face of the ordinary world, redeemed by the interruption. Spring would come again. The town would bloom. The warnings would be retold and misremembered and corrected in kitchens, softened in classrooms, hardened on stoops where stubbornness still kept vigil. New babies would be baptized. Elders would be buried with psalms. The diner would change its coffee brand, and half the town would grumble, and the other half would not notice. Life would go on, and that was the point. Eternity had leaned close not to replace Tuesday, but to teach it to speak of God. On a quiet afternoon, Pastor Michael walked the churchyard path where names sleep beneath dates. He stopped at a stone worn by weather and prayer and traced the engraving with a gloved finger. "Dust to dust," he murmured, hearing in those words not resignation but promise. He thought of the boy, of the fire that warns and the light that heals, of doors held open by a wounded hand. He did not ask for more signs. He asked for the courage to keep saying, "Come with his life." As for Brian, the visions no longer visited like storms. They resembled weather in a kinder sense. The kind that says, "Carry a sweater. The evening will be cool." Sometimes, When a stranger's shadow crossed the Morgan threshold, the boy would glance at the door and nod, as if relieved to see it still open. He played, he prayed, he grew. And if, on rare nights, he woke with the echo of a voice in his room, he simply whispered back, "I told them, I'm still telling." The story does not end. It resolves into a key the heart can keep singing under its breath. The warning is not a threat, but a mercy. The fire is not a final word, but a refining. The door is not a trick, but a gift. Bethlehem remains a small American town where mail arrives late sometimes, and where someone always forgets to salt the steps, and where a child once said God told him to warn everyone, and everyone learned that warning, in the mouth of love, sounds like invitation. How many things does God whisper to the world, and how many do we truly hear?